John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy in America?
I'm Thomas Jefferson, and I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
The framers of our Constitution designed a really outstanding system of government. The best one that's yet been designed by the minds of men. A system that became and remains the model that men of other nations strive to emulate when they establish their own systems of democratic self-government. But no system is perfect, and no system is immune from the exigencies of real-world politics. And never has that been made more clear than it was 225 years ago today, Wednesday, the 3rd of December, 1800, when the Electoral College convened to cast its votes in the presidential election, and the two running mates from the Democratic-Republican Party, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia and Aaron Burr of New York, finished with an identical total of 73 votes, which wasn't supposed to happen. Why wasn't it supposed to happen? Stay tuned, we'll get to that. And now that it has happened, what the hell are we supposed to do about it? Stay tuned. We'll get to that as well. Meanwhile, if you're President John Adams, you're saying, damn, I just became the first incumbent president to be voted out of office. I've run for president 3 times now, and I have lost twice. Why, I've got half a mind to go back home to my farm in Massachusetts and spend the remaining 26 years of my life shoveling cow shit, thatching the roof, and brooding about how much my country doesn't love me. If you thought the election of 2000 was a clown show, you would be right. If you thought the election of 1876 was also a clown show, one that almost ignited a second civil war, you would be right about that too. But there is only one election in our history that was a clown show of such ridiculous proportions, we had to amend the Constitution so that such a clown show could never happen again. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the election of 1800. It is Wednesday, the 3rd of December. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we have always thought that dueling with swords is more honorable than dueling with pistols, and hopefully Aaron Burr won't fatally shoot me for thinking that. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about the best intentions of the framers of our federal Constitution. It might surprise you to learn that the manner of selecting the nation's chief executive was one of the last items of business to which they got around to attending at the Constitutional Convention. There was actually far more debate over what to call the office of the chief executive, spoiler alert, they settled on president, than there ever was over determining who that chief executive should be or whether there should be a vice president or who the vice president should be. This was all dealt with in the last couple days of the convention under the heading of leftover business. And that fact alone provides a valuable insight into the kind of system of government our founders thought they were designing. They viewed the presidency as mostly an afterthought and the vice presidency as less than an afterthought. The president would conduct our foreign policy, subject to the oversight of Congress, of course, and he would be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. But the Congress was going to be the primary organ of national governance. We've got a House of Representatives that's directly elected by the people themselves, and we've got a Senate whose members are chosen by and are the representatives of the respective state legislatures. And I will spare you from my customary anti-17th Amendment rant because you have heard it before. And as far as the framers of the Constitution were concerned, the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate were each going to be more powerful in terms of internal domestic governance than the President of the United States was going to be. In fact, the people of the country wouldn't have all that much reason to know or care who the President of the United States was. And how do we know they viewed it that way? Because when they came up with the idea of the Electoral College as a means of electing the president and the vice president, the way that it worked in practice for the first 4 elections prior to the fiasco of 1800 and the subsequent passage of the 12th Amendment that resulted from it, when you went to cast your vote for the presidency, the names of the presidential candidates didn't actually appear anywhere on your ballot. The names on the ballot were the names of the guys who were running to represent your state in the Electoral College. So if there was a certain guy you wanted to be the president, you had to vote for an elector who supported that same guy. Now, there were a lot of tensions at the Constitutional Convention. There were north-south tensions, there were big state, small state tensions, but there were certain things that everybody agreed on, and one of those was that we don't want political parties, because political parties suck and they ruin everything. So when they devised a system where the guy who finished first in the Electoral College would be the president and the guy who finished second would be the vice president, it was in the hopes that such a system would help to forestall the formation of political parties. The original idea was that the president of the Senate would then become the vice president. They hadn't laid down any rules in the Constitution for how the Senate was to choose who its president was, or even if the president of the Senate had to be an actual senator. But in the end, they wound up flipping that idea right on its head. They said the number 2 finisher in the presidential race will be the vice president, and he will be the president of the Senate. But by the election of 1800, that whole idealistic notion of having no political parties lay in ruins. And we had a Federalist Party and a Democratic Republican Party. And presidential candidates had begun choosing running mates for vice president, just as they do today. So the Federalists say our ticket is President John Adams for president and Charles Pinckney for vice president. And the Democratic Republicans say our ticket is Thomas Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr for vice president. But wait, hold on, pump the brakes for just a second. How are you supposed to fit that model into the system prescribed by the Constitution, where each member of the Electoral College gets 2 votes and no distinction is made between a vote for president and a vote for vice president? Well, the 2 parties think they have got a workaround for that. So here's what we're going to do. All of our electors will cast their 2 votes for our presidential candidate and our vice presidential candidate, except for one guy. We will get that one guy to either leave his second vote blank or vote for Mickey Mouse or some random person. And then, when we win the election, our presidential candidate will have 1 more electoral vote than our vice presidential candidate will, and Bob's your uncle. It works out just the way we planned it. If you think that sounds like a bad plan that is doomed to fail, you are not wrong. Though it did work out as planned on the Federalist side. John Adams gets 64 electoral votes, Charles Pinckney gets 64. But over on the Democrat-Republican side, the winning side, everything went straight to shit. We still don't know whether this was the result of Aaron Burr privately campaigning for the top job for himself and trying to backstab the guy whose running mate he was supposed to be. There is still a spirited debate on that question right up to the present day, but in the actual event, the plan did not work out as planned, and Jefferson and Burr both wind up with 73 electoral votes. And so, per the procedure that was laid originally in the Constitution, if there is a deadlock in the Electoral College, then the election gets kicked to the House of Representatives. Each state delegation gets 1 co-equal vote. We've got 16 states back in 1800, so this should be just a formality, right? The Jefferson-Burr ticket was clearly the choice of the electorate in preference to the Adams-Pinckney ticket, so this should just be a formality, right? All that's required in the contingent election in the House of Representatives is 9 votes out of 16, so this should just be a formality, right? Except it's not just a formality, because Aaron Burr, well, he's kind of a dickhead. And he's not really the most honest or the most honorable man that ever lived. So yes, it should have been just a formality, even setting aside the question of whether he was working behind the scenes to engineer the 73-all tie in the Electoral College, which he almost certainly was, but even still, he could have put all that talk to rest by simply saying, I am Mr. Jefferson's running mate, I am loyal to him and to the party, and so I encourage the state delegations to confirm his rightful victory by voting for him and not for me. But sometimes when you place a man in close proximity to power, it makes him reveal the kind of man he really is. So Aaron Burr didn't do the honorable thing, he did the opposite of the honorable thing. He started openly campaigning for the presidency. He reversed pretty much all of his positions, and he became, as a practical matter, the replacement for John Adams as the Federalist candidate for the purposes of the contingency election in the House. He says, hey, we've got 16 states, half of them have Federalist majorities, half of them have Democratic Republican majorities, so I have got just as good a chance at winning this thing as Jefferson does, so screw him, I am going for it. The Federalists, they were really terrified of a Jefferson presidency. They were fully convinced he was going to wreck the entire American experiment if he managed to get into office. So even though Aaron Burr was a backstabbing turncoat who had just flip-flopped all of his stated positions in order to have a chance at securing the presidency for himself, they were all too happy to throw their support behind him in the present circumstances because they thought a Jefferson presidency was a worst-case scenario that was too terrible to even contemplate. In the view of the Federalists, not only was Jefferson too devoted to the idea of a weak, passive central government, but back when he was in Paris during the outbreak of the French Revolution and the series of events that led up to it, he had gotten entirely too caught up in the spirit of the moment, and he had expressed entirely too much sympathy toward the idea of political disputes being settled by the effusion of blood. In fact, one of Jefferson's most famous quotes, the one that says, "The tree of liberty must be from time to time refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants," was written from Paris in November of 1787, when it was starting to become clear that there wasn't going to be any peaceful settlement, and France was teetering on the brink of open revolt and civil war. In Jefferson's mind, the French example wasn't comparable to the American Revolution because we were simply throwing off the shackles of being governed by a distant foreign power, whereas the French people were attempting to change the manner of their own domestic governance. But in the minds of the Federalists, those words that Jefferson had written a little over a decade ago meant that if he was going to be elevated to being the chief executive of the American government, he wouldn't feel all that much compunction about setting up guillotines in Washington and New York and Philadelphia and lopping off the heads of his political critics. It was kind of a self-contradictory view, of course, since it doesn't make much sense to criticize a man on the one hand for being a weak, impotent central government supporter and arguing simultaneously that he's going to be an autocratic tyrant who executes his perceived enemies, but then, I guess, intellectual consistency has never been really a central feature of our presidential campaigns. But Aaron Burr, who just a few weeks ago was Jefferson's loyal and dutiful deputy, he was all too happy to stoke these sentiments if it brought him closer to gaining the presidency for himself, but he can't have been putting all that much thought into the ramifications of the approach he was taking. Because I guess political power is one hell of a drug. But dude, one or the other of you is going to be the president, and the other guy is going to have to be the vice president because that is the system we still have in the year 1800. So if you backstab Jefferson and turn yourself into his opponent and his enemy, and your gamble doesn't pay off and you wind up losing, you still have to be his vice president for the next 4 years. Do you think he's going to give you anything good to do in those circumstances? Do you think he's going to trust you with any meaningful duties whatsoever? And conversely, if your backstabbing turncoat campaign does succeed and you become the president, the guy you backstabbed is going to be your vice president for the next 4 years. Do you think he's going to be your loyal deputy after you heel turned on him and took his spot by intrigue and subterfuge? Or is he going to do everything in his power to utterly destroy you and your presidency? What I'm trying to say here, Mr. Burr, is I feel like you haven't fully thought this thing through. It's on Wednesday, the 11th of February, 1801, when these matters all come to a head. That was the day Congress convenes to count the electoral votes that had been cast back on the 3rd of December, 1800. Does that seem like a long interval? Yes, it does. But if there's anything we know about Congress, it's that they like to take very long, very luxurious winter breaks. And those breaks are even longer when it's goddamn 1800 and there's no airplanes or railroads. But once they had cracked open the envelopes and tallied the votes and discovered that Mr. Jefferson and his running mate, Mr. Burr, had an identical total of 73 electoral votes each, they quickly concluded, shit, we've got a fairly serious problem here. And to their credit, they managed to begin the contingency election on the very afternoon of the same day. But Aaron Burr was already on the scene, ready to position himself as the champion of the Federalist cause against his erstwhile mentor and running mate, Mr. Jefferson, which would seem to bolster the argument that he had engineered this tie vote behind the scenes. So next, we got 7 days and 35 ballots of deadlocked votes. 8 states for Jefferson, 8 states for Burr. Several states are on the knife edge. Only one vote in the delegation needs to flip one way or the other, but it remains stubbornly 8-8 throughout the week. It seems like there is no possible end to this impasse until Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist of all Federalists, starts going around the room trying to impress upon his fellow party members that, come on, boys, what we're doing here isn't right. Irrespective of how we feel about him and his policies, Mr. Jefferson is clearly the rightful victor here. Mr. Burr is clearly engaged in subterfuge and malfeasance. And do we really want to support a man like that just because he is telling us what we want to hear so he can get himself into power? And whatever it was that Hamilton actually said, he managed to flip 3 states. And on the 36th ballot, Jefferson wins 11 states to 5. And in the eyes of Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton has just become his mortal enemy. As the second place finisher, Burr duly becomes Jefferson's vice president. Nobody trusts him, because of course they don't. He isn't given anything worthwhile to do, because of course he isn't. And by 1804, when the 12th Amendment has now been ratified, so that a thing like 1800 can never happen again, it's common knowledge that he is about to be dropped from the ticket. So Burr decides he is going to run for governor of New York instead. Hamilton vigorously campaigns against him, and Burr loses. And he blames Hamilton for his loss, just as he still blames him for denying him the presidency 4 years ago. And you know what this means. Burr now has only one avenue of recourse for recovering his reputation, even though he doesn't have much of a reputation left in any event. Sir, you have affronted my honor. I demand satisfaction. I throw down the gauntlet and challenge you to a duel. Weehawken, New Jersey, Wednesday, 11 July, 1804 is the fateful day. Hamilton has accepted the challenge, because you have to accept it, or else you come off looking like a pussy. But this isn't supposed to be a thing where people actually get hurt or killed. It's more of a ritualized dick measuring contest. You go through the motions, you each miss your shot intentionally, both parties go home with their honor intact. At least that's what Hamilton thought it was. Burr, on the other hand, who is still the sitting vice president of the United States at this point, he actually wants to kill Hamilton. So Hamilton shoots high and wide, as is the custom, but Burr shoots Hamilton directly in the gut, and Hamilton spends the next 24 hours dying a very miserable, agonizing death. Like I said, Aaron Burr was kind of a dickhead. Whatever shreds of his reputation and good name he still retained, they died with Alexander Hamilton. He spends the rest of his life being regarded as a barbarian and a pariah, and nobody ever richly more deserved that fate. What did the 12th Amendment do? Well, it did a couple of things. First, it stipulated that each elector still gets 2 votes, but one vote is expressly for president, the other vote is expressly for vice president. Second, it created the rule that the winner of the presidential election must command an absolute majority of the electoral votes cast. And it's worked out just as intended, for we have avoided a repeat of anything resembling what happened in 1800, but we still, unfortunately, are stuck with political parties. And they are still the biggest impediment to the effective functioning of the system as our founders devised it when they wrote the Constitution, just as they feared was going to be the case. And with that, I am done. That's about all I've got. This has been Curmudgeon's Corner for Wednesday, the 3rd of December, 2025. My daughter Lauren would have turned 27 today. It would be stupid and pointless trying to put into words how much I miss her or what life has been like for the last 447 days. It would be stupid and pointless trying to construct a metaphor that adequately conveys the reality of that experience to those who have been lucky enough not to experience it. So I will close by saying please never pass up a chance to hug your kids and tell them how much you treasure them. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Baby, I ain't no